Head across the North Atlantic, Nazi bombers were spotted over the Solent. Precisely where she would have been sailing en route to Southampton. It was a dramatic escape, especially for a ship that had never been to sea before.
And there was still launch gear affixed beneath the water. She'd had no engine trials. She'd had no trials of any kind. Her sea trials were crossing at speed, evading U-boats across the North Atlantic. She arrived unannounced. The Coast Guardsman standing on the beach out at Fire Island suddenly saw what he described as a great gray ghost coming out of the mist, and it was the Queen Elizabeth.
It was the first time the maiden voyage of such an important liner had gone unheralded. Next to that of the Titanic, it would have to rate as one of the most dramatic maiden voyages in history. At New York, the Queen Elizabeth found herself in good company.
And she and the Mary and the Normandy, the three monsters, the longshoremen call them, tied up in New York for 2 weeks together in March of 1940. And it was a low point of the war for the Allies because the Low Countries were being overrun. France was about to surrender. And then the Queen Mary went to war.
In mid-April 1940, after a 4-week voyage from New York, the Queen Mary sailed through Sydney Heads. Over the next 2 weeks, Australian shipworkers would transform the luxury liner into a troop ship. She was joined in Sydney by 6 other British liners, including the new Mauretania and the First World War veteran Aquitania. Together, they were to make the first great armada of the Second World War. The liners were soon packed with 14,000 Australian and New Zealand soldiers prepared to sail to the other side of the globe to fight yet another war for their king and empire. If she met with disaster at the hands of a U-boat, it would be a propaganda coup for Germany. The voyage would take more than 5 weeks to reach Scotland. Everyone involved was conscious of both the risks and the importance of the mission to the survival of Britain.
When you're down below in a ship, in the hull of a ship, you're normally the lower part of the ship, and you can see the steel structure of the ship there, and here's your bunk there, you think, crikey, if a torpedo hits us there, I was frightened.
After rounding the Cape of Good Hope, the convoy sailed north, but the liners were built for the bitter cold of the North Atlantic, not the stifling heat of equatorial waters.
Unfortunately, the Aquitania was not air-conditioned. She was a hot ship. She stunk with heat. I mean, I used to sleep on the forward deck on a mattress. I never slept down, but it was too hot. And the Australians used to try and get onto the deck, so the whole upper structure of the ship was full of Australian soldiers and crew to get air. Terrible.
What should have been a triumphant arrival of new troops to strengthen Britain was overshadowed by the news that France had offered its surrender to Germany only hours before. Hitler was soon standing on a French beach, casting his eye across the English Channel to Britain, a mere 20 miles away. Bombs were soon falling on London, and Britain was now facing one of the most dangerous periods in her long history. Despite the fear of a German invasion, Britain's new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, dispatched another fleet of liners carrying British troops away from their homeland. They were destined for the Middle East, where Italy had opened up another front. For nearly 100 years, British liners had sustained the empire. Now they were fighting for its very survival. At stake, the Suez Canal, the lifeline for vital war supplies. Convoys also arrived at the Suez from Australia and New Zealand. But by late 1940, it was clear that Britain's hope for survival rested on its need for more fighting men and even more ships to carry them. In November of that year, the largest ship in the world, the Queen Elizabeth, slipped out of New York Harbor to join the Queen Mary, shuttling troops from Australia to the Middle East. The America she was leaving was staying out of the conflict, but the next time she visited, the United States would be at war.
Since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
One day after the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt seized the French liner Normandy and ordered her transformation into a troop ship as quickly as possible. But fear of foreign espionage enveloped New York Harbor. Americans felt surrounded by saboteurs.
During her conversion into a troop transport, fire breaks out in the 83,000-ton liner Normandy, recently renamed Lafayette. Thousands of workers had to flee for their lives as flames roared through the one-time French luxury liner. The dockside at New York Harbor is cleared as firemen and operators from all over Manhattan fight the stubborn blaze that rages for 4 hours. Not sabotage? I wonder.
The Normandy wasn't done in by a German saboteur. She was done in by sheer carelessness. Men were cutting a cutting job in the Grand Salon, and the man holding the asbestos shield took it away a fraction of a second too early, and white-hot fragments fell onto Kapok life preservers bundled in tarred paper and new burlap, and they started to burn.
While the fire was contained to the top 3 decks, a new danger presented itself. The closing of the fireproof doors prevented the escape of thousands of tons of water poured into her from the fire hoses. Gradually, Normandy became top-heavy and took on a dangerous list.
I found Vladimir Yorkovich in the crowd. He was the designer of the hull of the ship. And he had just been to Admiral Adolphus Andrews, who was the Navy man in charge. And he told me, he said, I told him that, let me on board. I can find the seacocks blindfolded. I will open the seacocks, the ship will sink 3 feet and be perfectly level. She will not tip over. Andrews said, this is a Navy job. And that was the end of the Normandy.
You can't imagine the size of this monster laying on its side. She looked like some big whale that just rolled over in the berth. But some people, I think, came down at one time and sailed there, and just to look at her and damn near cry that she was gone.
It was a disaster that did not have to happen. And it also deprived us of one of the greatest troop ships in the world for World War II. And we needed troop ships right at that time.
With America finally at war, the role of the liners would be a vital necessity. After the loss of the Normandy, the Queen Mary was flying the American flag and carrying her troops to the other side of the globe. Their task, to begin the battle for the Asia-Pacific and help defend northern Australia, which by now was under Japanese attack. Her troop-carrying capacity had been increased